Man, I had that computer.
Yeah.
I think it's in my dad's basement somewhere. Is it worth any money now?
We weren't so, we were Commodore 64.
Okay, you should be good.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, and welcome to our December CPC seminar. I am so pleased to introduce Dr. Jed Brubaker, who is coming from CU Boulder campus. He is an associate professor in the in information sciences, also a founding faculty, and really brings together a really interesting blend of both academic pursuit and industry experience, which I think probably in the tech world is incredibly important for anyone out there with an MD. He also, I just found out you worked at the AAMC,
Yeah.
working on the MCAT test.
I'm sorry.
Interesting. Just so to keep it, I don't think anyone here is
I mean, I can tell you
directly affected. And runs the Identity Lab, which is a really innovative project, looking at a series of projects within the lab. And germane to our talk today is about how we think about legacy and digital accounts. We all are very attached to different social media posts and manage probably so much of our lives as evidenced by the dog treats I'm selling for my son, in all these kinds of digital platforms, and how do we cope with that when we're facing the end of our life. So it is in addition, Jed teaches, manages PhD students, and is running a large project funded by the National Science Foundation. So it is with great pleasure. And we met during the COVID pandemic, so we were saying it's a COVID silver lining of getting connected. So thank you.
And thank you all for having me. I tend to be pretty casual in my approach to presenting, so by all means, keep eating, interrupt me, throw things at me. If people are throwing things at me on Zoom, Ellen has told me that she will let me know, and then we'll get started. In the spirit of keeping things a little bit more casual, I also want to make sure there's lots of space for discussion too. So would really welcome your feedback. As Stacy said, I am at CU, and I do run this thing called the Identity Lab. In the Identity Lab, we're really interested in how technology captures, represents, and influences how we experience who we are. We'll get into that a little bit more in a few slides, but I wanted to start us off with a question. And this can be the interactive portion. If you want, there are sticky notes along the table. And for people on Zoom, of course, there's Zoom chat. And I'd love you to grab a sticky and a pen or writing device of some sort. And I'd love you to just take a guess an answer to this question. How much data do you think you will leave behind? You can operationalize that in any way that you like. I'll let you know that later. I'll talk about this in terms of the number of accounts and the quantity of data in terms of size, megabytes, gigabytes, etc. And while you're thinking about this question, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on who I am and what I hope you'll take away from today. The first thing I'm going to set out there axiomatically is that the people designing and running our technology have put little to no thought into what happens after we die. And this is an issue I stumbled into early on in my doctoral work when I was researching online memorials on social media. And at the time, I was really interested in three particular questions. What happens to our digital identities after we die? How do people reappropriate spaces to remember and memorialize their loved ones? And what are all the diverse stakeholders and actors in this space? In my field, we tend to talk a lot about user-centered design, but the user in this case, we might presume is the account holder, is dead. And so there's all other kinds of stakeholders that the design approaches that we have in technology don't know how to account for. The answer to these three questions briefly ends up being that, well, our online identities, or digital identities continue to exist, and they actually evolve. They keep changing as people, particularly on social media, come and post on profiles or contribute to things that we created while we were alive. The profiles move from being places where we shared our lives. You can kind of think about it as like the point from which we disseminate information, to a nexus where people then combine and come together to share and remember loved ones. And then the stakeholders, as I mentioned, are more diverse. And when we're thinking about design around mortality, we can't just think about a single user who uses. Come on in. We have to also be thinking about their friends, family, loved ones, stakeholders like the platform, and all the people who are involved in and connected to these spaces. Get a pause for a quick Zoom check-in moment. Is everything okay?
Nobody's on the chat.
Oh, well, nothing to post just yet, because we're just thinking about that question. As Stacey mentioned, I've done a lot of work around what happens after people die. And I had the opportunity to eventually go to Facebook, where I was able to put my research into practice, creating and designing legacy contact and the memorialized profiles there. But more recently, I've been broadening my focus to think beyond just social media and thinking about all the kinds of digital accounts and data that we have throughout our lives. So this brings us to 4 takeaways. Just gonna abstract this and get you right to the important stuff. There's been little thought put into what happens after we die. Digital legacies are a growing challenge space, and they have some really fiddly, nuanced social and technical interdependencies. Currently, online platforms provide very little support for end-of-life needs, but identifying what those needs even are is a kind of significant challenge that I'm still trying to do. So if you have ideas and thoughts, I'll take that. All right, so let's go back to this question. For people who are on chat, you can hit enter. I oftentimes do this with my students, like I'll have a lecture hall of 100 people write something in chat, but not let anyone hit enter and then tell them to do it all at once. But I'm curious how much data you all think we're leaving behind. And again, you can operationalize this however you like. Guesses, thoughts?
I have
way
over
too much.
90,000 emails in my inbox.
I've never heard someone operationalize that.
Maybe
I
someone
can-
could come answer after your death.
I can relate to
Finally
that.
get to inbox 0.
But multiple emails accounts
Right.
and multiple,
That's just one Stacey?
that's just one.
Nice.
Yeah.
So 90,000 emails will be left behind from Stacey. Other ways that people answer this question? You can be brave.
1/2 to 1 terabyte.
Half to 1 terabyte. Okay, 500 gigs to a terabyte. Thank you for giving me a data size quantity, because I have some specific numbers I can give you in just a moment. What did other people say? Jamie?
Too
What?
much.
Too much.
Too much.
Well, actually, I mean, that's really interesting, because when we think about too much, I like that answer because it's a relative answer or it's a relational answer, too much relative to something. For you, maybe it's too much to handle, maybe too much for your loved ones to handle. And then we can actually think about from cultural practices around end-of-life planning. Swedish death cleaning is coming to mind. The practice of, in the later stages of life, going through and actually cleaning out your attic so that your grandchildren don't have to. And it's kind of built culturally into their world, which is actually great, because one thing we know from literature around bequeathal is that if you have an heirloom, give it to someone while you're still alive, because it's very common that people receive heirlooms and they don't know what the significance was of it. So they know it was important to, like, Uncle Tony, but they don't know why. And so then they have this object that's an obligation rather than something that they can actually cherish and do meaning making around. Other things that people guessed. Yeah.
I just said a lot with an exclamation mark.
But
But I
only one. You were like doing better than Stacey.
No, but thinking like not only about sort of our data files and emails and stuff, but I'm like wearing my personal tracking device today, and like the digital footprint that we leave every single day and every interaction that we have, like the Zoom recording,
Yeah.
everything.
Absolutely. So let me give you some numbers. And these numbers are a little bit soft because they're like best guesses and they're coming from industry research, but it's kind of an impossible thing to figure out. But the best guesses out there from the people, at least I trust the most, and I guess by proxy you're trusting me, is that the average user of the internet, and this is an international number, has 190 accounts. So if you think about end of life planning for say bank accounts, well, maybe, you know, you have like, you invested in every cryptocurrency that's ever popped, but maybe you have 10, right? But like, we're talking about 190. And then in terms of the amount of data, I'm really sorry, but you were very, very wrong. And it turns out I really was when I first stepped into this as well. Right now, the average internet user is producing over 850 gigs per year. To put that in perspective, researchers at Microsoft Research in 2004 in a project called My Life Bits were estimating how much they thought the entire sum of data for your lifespan would be. And they originally said 1 gig. And then in 2004, they updated it and they're like, well, there's this DVD thing. So we think 4.7 gigs, which is how much a DVD back then could hold. But that means that if you extrapolate this 850 to an average generic lifespan, the estimate has basically gone up by 10,000%. So, and that's not even me presuming any trajectory. And there's significant logistical issues. Like, so that's like a number, great, but let's actually make it concrete because emails are concrete things, really small when it comes to how much data they use. There are really significant logistical issues here. For example, how many of you have opted to have your utility bill sent to that email? Would your spouse be able to get access to it if you died? There are also significant legacy issues here. The scrapbooks we may have flipped through as children, well, they've all been replaced with online photo services. How will our children access these? Not even our spouse, but like, will Google Photos be a thing for our children and our grandchildren? So perhaps a better question than this one is maybe, what do you want your legacy to be? Maybe size is not the right thing to think about. Maybe symbolically, qualitatively, what do you want it to be? And if you're anything like the participants I've worked with over the last decade, this is an exciting and interesting question that then your brain immediately fails to answer because it kind of hits a wall. We don't know how to think about this.
Companies try to get rid of accounts at any point, like if you haven't used it for X years.
Do you want like the sexy diversion story? Like totally not off script, but
Like, how does Facebook decide you're dead? That they don't need your memories anymore.
anyone who's ever written a dissertation knows that you have a chapter that the committee hates. They're like, fine, we'll look over that chapter. It's also my favorite chapter, and it's the entire history of how did we even get into this mess in the first place. And it turns out, historically, everything was tied to a credit card. And the game changer, in ways they did not anticipate, was, brace yourself, it was Hotmail. Hotmail changed everything. Hotmail was the first large-scale online service that anyone could sign up for themselves that didn't require a credit card. And that meant, one, it was a haven for people doing email spam stuff, but also created a problem when it comes to what's called disposition. Historically, you would work in a company or here at CU and you like get a job and they create you an account. Here's your identity, blah, 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 blah. And then you do something horrid and they fire you and they turn off the identity and there's someone managing that. We see a shift with online services to you creating your own accounts and you canceling them, but there's a credit card attached. Think CompuServe, Prodigy, AOL. Hotmail steps in, it's the first time at scale that we have one that isn't attached to a credit card. And that means that if you die and someone, your loved one cancels your credit cards, well, there's no kind of trigger that will let Hotmail know that you've died. Hotmail also had the problem of storage being really, really expensive. And so they had a policy, and it changed over the years, of closing accounts that had been inactive for between 30 to 270 days. And it kind of bounces around. And that's really good for system efficiency and maintenance management. Except then this thing called social media happens and this other thing called cloud computing happens. And all of a sudden the cost of maintaining data drops through the floor. And the potential value of mining that data goes through the roof. And so now we have online platforms who, even if they're looking at your data in a completely anonymized way, particularly fueling like the AI revolution, it is more beneficial for them to keep it around than just to delete it. Although we do still see instances in which things will be automatically deleted after a certain amount of time. So I've been talking a lot about digital legacy. Let's do some definitional work. From the medical literature, digital legacy is defined as digital information that's available after someone's death, and it includes things like communication, photos, social media, other data, and online accounts. And in this article that I absolutely love for reasons you'll see in 2 slides, digital legacy has been identified as like a key digital health priority, particularly in the context of palliative care research. What we also know is, we've already established, the volume is growing and it's creating new challenges. However, we are seeing examples of where healthcare professionals can play a role. I do want to highlight that there are only a few of these studies that are out there, and they're all really within the last 5 years, maybe even the last 3 years, depending on where you want to call it cusp, but they are out there. However, as Coop and Marlowe argued, digital legacy isn't something that is discussed a lot in clinical practice. So we don't even know what people want to have happen. So if you want, you can grab another sticky note and think to yourself, what would you want to happen with your stuff? And as we found in some research that I'll get to in a moment, this can be a really hard question to answer. So maybe think about like one service and what you'd want to have happen with it. Maybe just choose one platform. This ends up being a space that's not very amenable to blanket statements. Of course, there is research beyond medicine. And I do most of my research in the field of human-computer interaction. And in human-computer interaction, we've been looking at the space for about 15 years. And what we have found, particularly looking at what happens after death, is that there can be extreme emotional difficulties for people who, during one of the hardest moments of their lives, all of a sudden have to deal with new technologies, new communities, new kind of spaces, oftentimes spaces that aren't designed to support them in any way. There are some technical reasons why in HCI literature, we also know that if we're going to be planning for people's digital legacies, we need to be doing this in the context of end-of-life planning more generally. This is something that's come out of my lab pretty kind of blazingly clear, is we kept running into problems when we were trying to create solutions at the post-mortem stage, because so often people were wondering, well, what do they want? I just wish I knew. And to date, there isn't really a good way, there's no agreed upon models of how to go about doing end-of-life planning in this space. And there aren't really any standards that can help tech companies know what actually to build. One of the big problems we see from HCI literature is what I call the split experience problem. When we design tech, we think about what does the person want? They're gonna, fill out that email, and then they're gonna hit send, and then they get a confirmation that it was sent. But when it comes to end-of-life planning, you maybe state what you want, and you hit save, and you never get any feedback. You never actually see the ramifications of what you built, choices you made, what you designed. And we're not really good at knowing how to deal with that in technology design. This is as an issue that's sometimes referred to as slow interaction, as opposed to our default to fast interactions. How do you design a piece of technology where the interaction, rather than 10 seconds to send an email, takes 10 years or 10 generations? We don't know how to design those kind of solutions. But back to my favorite article of the day, back to medicine. I told you I'm a big fan of this paper, and it's because I'll confess that they argue for both my research agenda and the project goals of my current work that I'll be sharing with you today, which is nothing short of how should patients and caregivers be supported, and how should this actually be done. We have two challenges in technology. We have limited tools that can support any form of advanced planning, and that's because there's unclear user needs. What should it look like? We don't know. And so there's a lack of requirements that we can give to tech companies saying, go build this. And that's because there's this kind of catch-22. It's actually kind of two catch-22s, maybe that's a catch-44. Here's what we know. We know that the most beneficial pro-social way to be doing this planning is pre-mortem, and that will solve post-mortem challenges. Oftentimes because people just want clarity on what the deceased loved one actually would have wanted. However, people are deferring their choices because it's like whatever my loved one wants. So there's this kind of hot potato problem. We also have a problem when it comes to the tech side. Because if I'm a tech company, because I've been there and I've done exactly this, and we want to build a thing, well, what do? We go ask people, what do they want? And people don't know how to answer this question. When you think about what you want with end-of-life planning, you're oftentimes referencing things that are based on your experience, maybe a parent, a grandparent who died. I don't think many of our grandparents had Instagram. There are not cultural scripts to inform or guide us about what makes sense and what doesn't. And that even imagines that these platforms are staying consistent in the first place. Facebook is only 18 years old. Like, which sounds really, really like a really forever to my freshmen, and who are just like, what are you talking about? No one uses that. But how much has it changed in that time? And then I talked to them about BeReal and how much is that going to change over the next couple of years? And they're all calling it deepfake already. But whatever. So when we're thinking about norms and cultural values that are really multi-generational and span kind of epochs, it's really weird to think about how should technology be fitting in and implementing that, even as we're like, BeReal is trying to redefine what the post is, right? And who knows what will happen after that, when we're constantly redefining what even the artifact itself is. So if you want to think about the research goals that I'm working on, the human-computer interaction information science version, we talk about socio-technical design spaces, where I'm interested in end-of-life planning for online accounts, and how do we design systems that support postmortem data management. Here is my best attempt at a medical version, which is that the long-term goals are to develop and validate an intervention for end-of-life planning for online accounts and data, and to produce best practices, both for the design of the system so that they can support the needs of people engaged in those end-of-life plans. And I hope you're already detecting a bit of a dependency here, that we need to know what people want, but what people can actually do is constrained by what these systems allow. These systems want to, in theory, support people in doing what they want, but they have to know what they are, and so there's this kind of weird issue. The construction of a perfect metaphor for the problem that is happening inside of this research space, where like it is definitely under construction. So in this NSF career grant that I'm working on, we are doing a formative study with life-limited cancer patients. And what we're doing is working with people to co-develop plans for accounts and data. We are using that process to develop best practices and in the end create design frameworks for tech and mortality. Some of the outputs that we're looking at in this project are serving people in the creation of those plans, developing best practices, frameworks, you've seen these, but also a digital end-of-life clinic where we are supporting the public who might be trying to engage in these kind of issues. Think about it like the Apple Genius Bar, but for mortality. Lots of the talks I see here have like a conceptual framework. So that is not something we do, but here's the start of my conceptual framework for this project, which is that if people can have legacies, then heart, love, that will be good. A more complicated way of looking at this is that we have these two levels, user needs and system supports and constraints. And so we're working with people to design those plans. I'll talk about the environmental scan in a moment. And in the process, we're identifying these limitations that are not just technical. We can't just engineer our way through them. They're also deeply social and cultural. They interplay with each other in a way that might be called socio-technical. Out of this, we hope to develop best practices for users so that if Stacy wants to develop a plan, we can be like, well, here's the 10-step guide. I would love a world in which it's like end-of-life planning for online accounts and data for dummies. That would be brilliant success. I'd love that.
Was there like, at the Hopkins Cancer Center, there was a person whose job was to like meet with people and she'd have them like write cards to their families for all important occasions, and she, would get them mailed out every year or whatever. And I feel like this is like the electronic version of
So
probably at a larger scale.
yeah, and I love that you bring that up because actually that's kind of what inspired the Cancer Connection, was thinking about people who were doing legacy work. I would say that it is 50% that, and then it is 50% the dumpster. Because some stuff just needs to go. And there is a process of making decisions. Something that we say in archival research is that the first and foremost responsibility of the archivist is to know what to throw away. And making those choices about maintenance versus dispossession. All right. Oh, I guess we can update this. And then one. Okay. So I want to talk to you about two studies. I'm going to spend most of my time on one and then just give you a little bit of a taste and would welcome some discussion about some tricky and gnarly problems we found on one. I'm going to talk about this environmental scan, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about this planning process. Because so much of what we're doing relies on what is actually possible, well, we need to go figure that out. I'm really familiar with what's possible when it comes to social media, in part because I built it. So like unfair advantage there. I know intimately what's going on at Facebook and Instagram, etc. But what about all the other platforms? So we did this environmental scan. And our purpose was to just figure out for the top platforms out there, what actually is supported and what isn't. What's the lay of the land? Three aims are, well, what are the categories of support for end of life? Like what should these even be? We wanted to then identify levels of support. There are multiple ways that you can get to your end goal, and then determine actually what the support was across the US. So at high level, we selected platforms, inductively developed a code book, coded the platforms, and then came and gave a talk at each. We started off by selecting platforms based on Alexa ratings, not the smart speaker, but a service that Amazon, I don't know who's in their product naming team, but like they have two products named Alexa. But one product called Alexa is used by marketers to figure out where the most frequently populated used services out there. And we took the top US platforms. You can see probably some of your favorites up here. If you're also looking at some of these and you're saying, what in heaven's name is that? You're not out of it. I don't recognize some of these either, but these are what they are. And so we went and figured them out. We inductively went and developed categories. And we did this based on a combination of analysis of a subset of platforms, but also our knowledge from, because I knew what could be done at Facebook, right? So like our knowledge from the field and from existing literature. And we came up with these 7 categories. These are the 7 things that we think are important for people to be able to achieve. And I do want to highlight that in this coding, we approached it from the perspective of the bereaved. Imagine that someone had died and you wanted to do a thing. 2 reasons. 1, people don't do advanced planning, and so we need to know what happens when your loved ones are stuck with cleaning out the attic. And 2, it turns out that this, from the perspective of the bereaved, is where tech companies have focused when they have focused, and it naturally bleeds into any kind of pre-mortem planning that might be possible. So you might want to get a backup or an archive of the data. It's like, just give me the photos and I'll put it on my hard drive. You might want to have an account be made yours. It was my sister's account, but now actually just make it my account. An example of this might be if I logged into my sister's Facebook account and changed her name and email address to be my information. You can imagine more technically sound ways of doing this. Sometimes I'm fine with my account, but I want the data that was in their account to be part of my account now. And so that's transferring the data itself. We have these 2 here, which are really about maintaining online legacies online. The first is memorialization. And the Facebook memorialized profile is a classic example here. There's some content is maintained in some way that designates that it's a memorialized status, it's protected, and we know that we're there in memory of someone. And then stewardship, which is completely self-serving. That's the theory that comes out of my doctoral work, which is when we design technology for someone to care for another person's stuff, but not act as them. So it's not logging in as someone. It's some kind of features that lets me do things for them. Legacy contact on Facebook is a good example. And for those stuck in exchange world, a delegate, like if you an executive like an executive admin who is looking on behalf of, is actually would fit the definition of stewardship. And then we have these two deletions, requesting it be deleted, and then back to Hotmail, automatic deletion. Any questions on those categories? If I've done my job, they're straightforward, and you're like, come on, let's get with it. Okay, great. Also, I mentioned there are different ways to get to our goals. Sometimes there's features, but let's not kid ourselves, that's not super common. Sometimes there's a way for the platform to do it, but they haven't built a button you can click. This typically would be like, hey, customer service, would you be willing to blah, 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 blah? And they have some kind of button behind the scenes that they can do. This is commonly used when there's some type of obligation or service that a platform wants to provide, but they haven't had the engineering staff to build it out into a feature, or they feel like customer service needs to be involved in some way to double check that the request or the thing should actually be able to happen. Side note, like this is like you can request an account memorialized, on Facebook as on many platforms, but it turns out that around 2010 it became a really fun coming of age like prank that men in the UK would play on their friends when they turned 16. They'd all go report that his Facebook account, that he had died. And it turns out it's kind of hard to inform a platform that you died. It's even harder to inform them that you're actually still alive. Like, there's not proof of like actually still aliveness. There are also workarounds. And the most common example here would be you get someone's username and password and you log in and you act as them. So the system doesn't know better. It's not really an end of life functionality. Just set up there. It's like a way to get to those ends. And then there are scenarios when it's just fundamentally not possible. All right. To code this, we looked at absolutely everything. It is the most squirrely process in the world because we're looking for things that there isn't a lot of documentation on. But most importantly, we spend a lot of time in the functionality of all these platforms and then workflow diagramming actually how you would accomplish every single possible outcome. In part because that Apple Genius Bar thing for mortality is not a joke, and we're building a documentation that the students who will work in it will be able to use to help people get to the solutions they need. All right, so let's look at some results. No one will be surprised, there's basically no support for end-of-life needs. This first diagram is focusing not on any of the particular categories, but just if we look across all the categories at the levels. And what we're seeing here is predominantly that we have no support and then middling success around policy and workarounds and features are lagging. But I think this diagram is a little bit more helpful for us to look at. Here we're looking at the percentage of the level by the category. So blue is feature, policy, and I'll let you read a legend. We can already start to see some patterns here, with deletion being supported the most, memorialization and stewardship having little support, and then some of these kind of technical management of the data itself. Still not as good as deletion, but doing a little bit better than what I'll call legacy options. Now I want to do a funny little math thing here, and it's like, this is totally fake math, but it is to put things in perspective. If we rank order the level of support, give feature a 3, policy a 2, workaround a 1, and then we sum it all up, we can imagine how close each of these categories are across the top 30 platforms towards reaching full support. And that looks like this. And what we're seeing is that even the most requested feature has barely mid 60%. And things around actually crafting legacy are sitting in around the 10% range. Now I want to bump us back to this graph one more time, and then I'm going to do a little slideshow show magic and cluster these. If we look at these types of categories, you can see that these top 3 are really about access and ownership of the data objects. These 2 are really about preserving and maintaining an online legacy. And then we have disposition down here. Again, we see the highest level of support for disposal. Access and ownership, we can see from here, they're supported, but largely through workarounds. It's also worth noting that transferring ownership of data from one account to another is just actually functionally not a thing pre and post-mortem kind of anywhere. I can't take a photo, post it on Facebook, and then somehow make it Stacy's photo. I can tag Stacy. Technically, Stacy has control over the tag, not the photo. An example of where this is possible is, say, a Google Doc, where like you might open up, I might add Stacy as a collaborator, and then I might change her and make her the owner. And so that would be a good example of taking the data and actually making it belong to a different entity. And then, of course, we're seeing the support for online legacies is trailing really far behind the others. However, I do want to note that since we started doing these environmental scans, we have been seeing new features developed. When memorialization and stewardship are implemented, it tends to be that the platform has thought really robustly about all of these issues. And most of what you would want to be doing in other places are handled through memorialization and stewardship. Legacy Contact on Facebook is a good example. So is GitHub. GitHub is a open source software repository, and it turns out that like maybe you have some software libraries that half the internet relies on. That is not a fake scenario, and then you die. That there are ways that GitHub has set up to make sure that it is maintained and cared for, stewarded by someone else. But I want to change this graph one more time and look at what I'm going to call true support. Let's take a peek at just these first two, because once we get into the latter two, the platform isn't doing anything. We're doing things despite the platform. And here, what we can see is that, well, while platforms are not really supporting digital legacy needs or work, we also can see a gradation going from these disposal to access to online legacy. And it coincidentally is also a gradation from easy to hard. It's easy to dispose of data. It's easy to go into grandmother's attic and decide all of it goes in the dumpster. Same is true for tech companies. It also maybe can reduce costs for them if they've mined it sufficiently. We see marginal support in access and ownership, and that's because there are some significant privacy and technical architecture challenges. A really big challenge we had at Facebook when doing Legacy Contact was wondering what types of expressions or things on someone's profile does a loved one have the right to change or not? And in our data, we found consistently that participants felt very split. Some people felt like, yeah, you want to put the best foot forward for them. Other people would say, no, you preserve it exactly the way it is because it was the authentic representation of them. Frustratingly, we oftentimes found these two beliefs were held about the same actual profile, which means there's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't approach. Funny little insight, I once suggested at Facebook that, well, why don't you let someone just delete it, but it would only delete for them. If you found that post offensive, maybe just remove it for your account. And an engineer, senior engineer at Facebook was like, oh, there's no way we can do that. And we were like, why? This is like the simplest fix to an easy social problem. He said, because we cache those pages. The computational expense of having someone's Facebook profile be customized for you and for you and for you is in the billions of dollars. So it's just like technically too, like business plan might cost prohibitive. So we're also seeing, of course, low support for online legacy work. In this sense, what we're seeing here is we're seeing diminished support when there is customization needed. People need to express some preferences about what it should be. When there's ambiguity about what we should do, like, do I keep this thing from grandma's attic? Do I not? And when there are technical challenges that may not be apparent to users, but like the actual mechanics of making the photo that I posted on Facebook now actually belong to Stacy is a funky underneath the hood kind of technical complication that sometimes can have costs in unfathomable amounts. That number still surprises me. However, I also think that when we look at a chart like this, I see two sides for intervention. I see opportunities for us on the user side and on the clinical side for us to help people plan on what to delete and help platforms start to increase deletion on request. There's no reason that this shouldn't be way higher. In our coding, if there was a form that was like, report that a loved one has died, that was just like a contact customer service form, but it was specifically for the purpose of someone's death, we actually counted that as a feature. in part because underneath the hood, it goes to a specific queue, a specific group in customer service that is specifically handling it, rather than it just going into the pile of generic customer service issues. It is worth noting that though platforms are increasingly providing that option, is one thing that we kind of saw through the pandemic was like, because people were dying, it's that companies were, I mean, there's no cause and effect here. This is totally a correlation, but we saw an increase in the number of platforms that had that kind of report that a loved one has died request that the account be deleted. The second site for intervention is, I think, is up here. I predict that in the next 5 years, we are going to start to see broader adoption of some combination of these three things across platforms. And that's largely because people are taking the platforms to court. And it can be easier for platforms to create something really straightforward like this. Yes, here's an archive of your loved one's stuff. In the US, platforms have been really resistant to this, and it has a little bit to do with US perspectives around individuality and privacy. In contrast, in Germany in particular, in the EU more broadly, there has been a lot of headway made for particularly parents having the right to get the access to the digital legacy of their children. I have mixed feelings about that because I've worked with a lot of participants who would not want their parents to have access to their digital legacies. So that's kind of a weird space as well. But the other thing that's nice about this is it removes the responsibility of the platforms for having to do any of this memorialization and stewardship work. Which leaves me thinking, if we want to be really innovative about ways that we could engage with patients around legacy making, end of life work, we might want to start designing systems to anticipate the ability for people to get this data and then allow us to pipe it in and make use of it in third-party and novel systems.
Have you done like any survey work on the extent that people like want versus not want things to be accessible?
This is the gnarliest problem. Yes, and it is some weird Rorschach test every time I do it, because people give really, really weird answers. At one point, when we did our first big scale survey to get insights on this, the numbers came back so weird that we decided to do some fault finding. And it turned out that people would say, oh, well, since I filled out that survey, I've been thinking about it. And my opinion now would be, actually, as I'm saying this out loud now, I'm almost wondering if I should have people sign up for a double survey where the first one's completely fake, and then we actually analyze the second one. What we found, and we find this particularly in our interview work when we're doing planning, and that's the study I'm going to talk about next, but only very briefly, is that people don't understand what the options are, and they don't understand what they want. And the process of kind of sorting through it and figuring it out, I think actually is perhaps the most important intervention in the space of this moment. I would love for like the raw numbers of focus here. We do have a project we're writing up right now where we did focus groups where we had people fill out a survey that did exactly that and then discuss their answers as a group to kind of get a combo of the two. Answers are still all over the map, but we do see some patterns around how people are trying to prevent losses that they don't want. Like, oh, we'll just keep it there because I might want it later. So there are a couple patterns there, but it's this weird, tricky thing. It's like a Heisenberg thing that, like, if you look at it, all of a sudden it shifts and the data gets squirrely. Did that answer your question? Okay, maybe not satisfactorily though.
I mean, it seems like if you knew that you did or didn't want it, you could just give someone an email password that gives them control to get into all the other things. Or a password keeper or any of those.
So yes, something of that variant, I think would enable all of these right now, light ones here, the workarounds. However, and like if you were to go find like digital legacy planning for dummies, it would tell you to write down your usernames and passwords in a safe, secure place and hand them to a loved one. The 5 major tech platforms right now are collectively working to eliminate the password. I do not know how many end-of-life plans are out there where people have collected, done the due diligence of getting usernames and passwords that are gonna just completely not work. How many of you have to open up Gmail to like on your phone before you can do it? Like, there's all this two-factor authentication stuff, and that's even considered not adequate. And it means that as our systems are getting more and more locked down, it's even more important that we think about people, like loved ones, who need to access it under certain conditions, because the workarounds are gonna go away. I absolutely agree with you. It's actually even bigger problem that no one's talking about. In terms of next steps on this project, we're actually right in the progress. There's literally an army of undergrads right now updating our coding across all of this for 2023. This time we're doing a little bit of a twist. It's my little clever Trojan horse. We're reaching out to all the products, all the platforms this year, and we're being like, we're gonna publish this research. Do we have the right results? I want them to come back and give us nuance. I also want contacts at all the companies that we don't have contacts for, so that when we say, you need to do this, we have someone, not just an empty customer service to talk to. I want to wrap that environmental stand up right there first. And I'm going to talk just really briefly about the other study. But if there are questions on this one before I move on, I'm happy to answer them. Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Right, I was just going to follow Lauren's question because if you have a loved one, you want to follow up, passed away, you want to follow up and talk about it ahead of time versus talk about it after the fact. It's different.
Talk about it after the fact, right?
Right, it's different because I don't know what I want. I don't know what I expect. What happened afterwards is somehow, it's unknown.
I have two thoughts here that are nowhere in the slide deck, and they both might be a little bit naive and a little bit Pollyanna-ish, so like, call me out if you think I'm wrong. But I think that there are two things going on here. I think that sometimes actually we don't care. Like, I actually don't care what happens to my Instagram account, but my loved one doesn't know that. And so I was asked a question, Stacey mentioned the TED Talk, and like, maybe the only smart thing I ever said was, I was asked basically this question after that talk, and I said, even if you don't care, tell your loved one that you do not care. The amount of guilt that I have seen as people try to weigh through, oh, should I do this? Give them permission to do what they want, even if it's you do you, go for it. Like, that is, because right now it's just oh, oops, I never thought about it. The second thing is, I think the end of life planning, this is such an information systems approach to this, I'm so sorry. I think it's just a big old usability problem. I think it's just a straight up usability problem. If you all could download an app right now, and in 3 clicks, we could cover 98% of the end of life issues that you have, you would use this app, right? Like, I don't need to customize my mortgage, or like, there's contracts, there's all these things that the boilerplate covers all of the most common scenarios. We need that here. I could be wrong. I'm seeing lots of ways in which I'm wrong, but my kind of fundamental driving focus here is that maybe let's be more modest. Let's be MBAs for a moment. There's an 80-20 rule here, that maybe we could cover 80% of the issues with 20% of the effort. Yeah, Jamie.
So, and just being familiar with your research, has made me think about this periodically, and so that's been advantageous for me. And I was thinking that there's possibly an analogy here with something, but part of my challenge is like, I don't even know where my accounts are, and that prevents me from even starting.
You mean you're not going to list the 190 accounts that you have right now on the spot?
Right, or the 250 that I've let go. I mean, I had a Yahoo email, I had a Hotmail email, all those things that I've just sort of MindSpring, AOL, all that stuff is probably still around somewhere for some of them. So here's where I'm going to. Part of what prevents me from actually taking action is the fact that it's sort of this gargantuan task that I see. But the analogy here is the software that has been advertised lately to go down and track all those subscriptions you have, you know, that you signed up for this streaming service and that streaming service, and you thought you did the one month for free, and then you've just been billed for it kind of thing, and you haven't used it in 6 years or whatever. Well, that probably predates streaming, but anyway, could there be something, a tool that would be the easy button that would get you to 80% of your online presence to feedback, and then you could say, because the other thing I think you may have alluded to this is the fact that I may not have an opinion about my Yahoo account, but I definitely have an opinion about my mortgage account versus, you know, Stacy's really concerned about her Yahoo account and doesn't care about her mortgage. But then you can make some individualized decisions about how you would want your footprint to go forward.
I mean, if we extend the mortgage Yahoo example, the mortgage has legal and policy
Yeah.
like requirements that have you protected, more or less. So I am told. We can imagine like a Yahoo scenario where maybe Stacy really cares about it, but technically cannot do anything. Like there is no support for any of that versus maybe say like a Facebook where there is some support for that. And so I think there are some gradations there and attacking it when it's like, do we do policy? Do we do tech design? My answer is all. Like any way we can make this happen. A lot of what you're talking about actually hits just, and I promise it's like only 2 slides, on what we're working on right now, which is this advanced planning. And this is work that we're doing where, I'm not gonna read this out loud, but where we have been doing co-design or participatory design with participants to figure out actually, what do you want? To see, you know, because I'm saying I evoked an 80-20 rule, but 80% of what? Like, what is the goal? What would good look like? And that requires that we just sit down with people and figure it out. We have this whole process where we are working with people, setting up what their plans are. And then in instances when they're like limited through Cancer Senator, we're anticipating their deaths and will continue to work with their loved ones after they die. Yeah.
Someone online, David Beckerman wants to ask a question.
Hey Jed, this is great work, such
David, I
important
can't quite hear
topics.
you.
Oh, any better now?
I have the wrong remote.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah, I
know.
got you now.
Again.
I can try typing it in if you can't hear me.
No,
but-
I can hear you now, David, go.
Oh, okay. I was just saying, great work, just so important. I'm so glad you're doing this work. I wanted to know what, as you think of, you know, industry incorporating some of your findings, you know, do they have, what are the incentives for them to do so? I guess I'm wondering, are there any business cases where, you know, they'd be incentivized, or is this going to be more on the regulatory end and policy, you know, sort of requiring them to? It's just hard to imagine that this is really going to come from the consumer end. Like, consumers are just unlikely to pick, you know, pick platforms based on these kinds of things. So I'm wondering, you know, it seems like it's going to need to come from the company or from the regulatory sense, but I imagine you've thought a lot about this. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I have, and I think the answer is both. And I've talked about that kind of like that easy to hard scale. The stuff that's easy, we see platforms already doing this because it's easy. And so it handles a customer service need. Once we get into things that are on the harder side, yeah, I alluded to how legal action, particularly in the EU, is forcing a lot of these platforms' hands. And I think, you know, I mean, Zuckerberg's on the record inviting regulation around this just to give clarity about what they should do and what they shouldn't do. You're right. You're right to point out though that there aren't much incentives. When I was at Facebook on the team called Compassion, it was a different era, and the ethos was we have more money than God, so we have a social responsibility to do something that we are uniquely positioned to socially be able to do. I do not think that would apply today. There is no such thing as a compassion team anymore. I think it was determined at one point that all engineers at Facebook were compassionate, so it had to be renamed. But so no, I do think it's going to have to come from all sides. But David, I think that like, even as I'm imagining how to make this happen, it all relies on us knowing what the it should be. And that's what this project is about. There is like a pivot we've had to do because recruiting cancer patients has been extremely difficult. I'm happy to talk with you about that. But right now, this is intended to be extremely small sample size, very in-depth, prolonged 3 to 5 year engagement with participants. We're working with 10 people right now. And these are some very early analysis, therefore dangerous, cautions, findings. Planning takes so much longer than I could have ever anticipated, and I've been doing this for 12 plus years. We have changed it from 190 accounts to list your top 3 accounts. And then we're finding that sometimes in our like needs gathering interview, it's like an hour, that we get through one of them. We're finding that needs are way more diverse than I could have ever expected. I was thinking about needs that are really within kind of the ideological framework of the platform. Maintain a profile, get access to the Google Drive files. And then in steps participant number 1, because it's always participant number 1. And she's like, well, I've been doing a lot of genealogical work around my Black heritage and ancestry. And what I want to have happen after I die is for that stuff to be collected in some way and given to a museum that they can make use of it. And so we're like, oh, okay, here we go. What museum? What does that look like? How do we do it? There are lots of scenarios in which actually cultural heritage is a motivational factor. Another participant, PO7, who is like a prolific fan fiction writer and wants people to know on Archive of Our Own that they've died, and came up with like a transparency statement was the term they used, that their spouse is supposed to post at the top of all of their messages, just like, I don't hate you, I'm actually not able to respond to your comments because I died. What we're also finding is the interview is the space where actually people are working through and figuring it all out. And I'm increasingly, this is baby thought here, but like, I'm wondering if that's the technology. Maybe the interview is the technology. Maybe it doesn't need an interface.
Do you also ask them if they've done other like advanced care planning and if this is covered in any of it?
It's been covered in 2 instances out of the 10, and it's so weak sauce that like it's like either a statement like loved one should take care of it, or here's an email password. And then this is my demon. This is like some circle of Dante's Inferno. We all it turns out we're all spaces, because our emails are our dumping grounds. It's all purposes, like, so sorting out what the purpose is, what the content is, who should get it, like, it's just this nebulous mess, because it just all gets lumped in there. There happens to be a colleague, Steve Wojda, who runs the Too Much Information Lab, who has a history of doing things like email management. And I'm really curious what he would think about how might we hack email to differentiate it, to figure out what its purposes are for the purposes of cleaning it. I want to wrap it up there with, again, these 4 takeaways, and which I won't go to my last slide. I'll just leave these here and say thank you. I think we're right at time, and so people have to run. I'm not offended at all, but it was a pleasure to come tell you my little stories and tell you what's going on in the lab and think through this space with you. So yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a number of questions. One was the business incentive, so that one's already been asked. So, is there anything specific to the cancer patients? Because I'm thinking, we've been talking, you went from the very general, and then you're doing the study on the cancer patients, and then, we're kind of back to the very general. But is there anything in there that's very specific to the cancer patients, do you think? Or you think you're going to find something that's very specific to cancer patients per se?
I could always use more reasons to focus on cancer patients, so like, give it to you. But the very specific reason that actually got, back in the day, got Stacy and I talking, was that is what we call in the lab the grandma problem. When we first started doing like just a couple cases of planning, it was when people would like want to do it, but for their grandmother, or their grandmother would die and they'd be like, well, should I memorialize the account? And what we would do is we'd go to these grandmothers' profiles and there was nothing there. And it turned out that grandma, quotes grandma in this instance, was using Facebook to look at children, photos of her grandchildren.
Yeah.
She wasn't like populating her life or doing what we call auto archiving.
Yeah.
And so rather than like it being a memorial or an archive, it was a key. It was a way to access. And in those cases, it was really nice to be able to tell people like, no, delete it. Like there's no, like it isn't doing anything. So why cancer patients? It's not just cancer patients, it's younger cancer patients. The motivation was to work with people who do not have the luxury of deferring their choices, who are life limited, but are young enough that so young enough here means 55 and under, who actually have a social media and digital presence in a way that the people who are 70 or 80 don't. This is me trying to get a 20-year head start on what things are gonna look like 20 years from now. So I'm just trying to play the population curve. But as I said, I would welcome other answers too.
I would actually comment on that. I would think, cancer patients specifically, science is so good right now in terms of treating cancer. There's a sort of predictability to some degree of a cancer patient's journey. And I think that in itself lends it an open pathway. Okay, I know this is probably about a 2-year process. Let me plan for those around me.
And you're grabbing like the other half, like I went technical, and that's actually the symbolic, which is that they're already engaged in symbolic legacy making activities in many instances. And so we were really thinking about this as a add-on to that, like, hey, you know, you made the video for when your son turns 15 or 16. You're already thinking about these kinds of things. Would you also be interested in us helping you out with this component, if that's important to you? So, I mean, I think the warm fuzzy version is it was a community that we identified as being that we could serve and that maybe would benefit the most.
Oh, yeah.
Hunting
Oh, for sure.
timidity could be another
sure.
one.
Interesting.
So I had another question. It has to do with this whole deletion thing.
Yeah.
I mean, there's deletion, right? And again, a true deletion, I would assume, on a platform, on the business level platform, could also be very expensive too, just because of the way the connections that are made between things and the way that this happens. And while I am beyond this, I'm not so much into social media. I can tell you though, my husband and I have both been shocked at just recently at a number of things where like accounts that we thought we closed years ago, right? They're still showing up on lists that banks get, credit card companies get, that sort of thing, right? And you think it's gone. So there's deletion and there's deletion. And so, you know, I'm wondering with these people when they say, I want everything deleted, right? Does that really happen? I mean, and can it happen? I mean, so that's part of the question.
So it can happen if we exclude derived data. So like if I analyze your data or I analyze your data as part of a whole bunch of data and I produce, say, a model, like some AI or machine learning model, like let's call that a derivative of the data, then I think that's too much for us to hope for. There is a distinction. I very cheekily in the past used to refer to delete versus the Irish delete. It used to be the case that like Facebook, when you deleted your account, they'd keep everything there in case you changed your mind. And then like if you opened your account again, it'd just all be there. No one could see it. They just wrap it up, boom. But then the EU said, no, if people delete, it has to be delete. And like auditors from the EU would show up at the Facebook Ireland and they would have set up something, then they delete it and then they verify it. And so there was something, something about like a fighting Irish kind of Irish delete thing in my head. It's like, oh no, it's a strong delete. But where those lines are is tricky. Most terms of use, like almost all of them, do not give the platform ownership of the data. They give it license of the data. But how you terminate that license is tricky. Yeah, here.
And going on like deletion and like if you personally delete things, are they truly deleted? It's like now anything you post can be like turned into a meme or like you can do remixes or duets on TikTok and Instagram. So like how, like, I guess are there discussions in terms of how to truly delete or get rid of those like legacies or like I guess that's a question of ownership too, is if like you post something, someone takes a screenshot of it and then repost that to something else, like do you actually own that now, and how how can you make sure that's deleted? Or like there's that dad that bought an NFT because there was the YouTube clip going around. So like, I guess what are the discussions with those?
So I'm gonna sidestep anything that has to do with the blockchain, because that's its like whole own lecture. But I will highlight that there is work in computer security and cryptography specifically that is about how can we ensure that the thing is deleted. And you can imagine like an image that you've circulated that has the ability to like recall it. But that means that anytime the image is opened, it would have to like kind of contact the authoritative source to be like, do I have the rights to open this up? And there's some architecture problems there that I'd love to nerd out on, different lecture. What I will highlight is that my focus here actually typically is on preservation. And that's because the default in technology is to delete. It wasn't until 2007, after the Virginia Tech shooting, that Facebook stopped deleting profiles when they found out someone had died, because for them it was a legal liability. The person who had signed the terms of service was no longer alive. There is so much, I see so much potential in our kind of data and things that we don't want lost, that the fight I'm engaged in is resisting the default unexamined deletion, going into grandma's attic, throwing everything in the dumpster, and in the process losing those precious items. I think there's an entire other project about identifying those precious items, but my general orientation here is in the direction of preservation. Yeah.
So do you think that there's a space for some of this research to not only educate kind of end of life, end of online life planning, but kind of beginning and throughout online life planning, like the idea of, to carry through the grandma's analogy attic, like don't be a hoarder so that there's so much stuff to delete, like manage your online space better?
Well, so on the one hand, like when I don't know if this is happening at Anschutz, but at Boulder, like we're having to move everything off of Google Drive, and maybe I have 2 terabytes of stuff, and maybe they're like, you have to drop that to 5 gigs, and it is just this monstrosity that has me like hitting the max of my like data transfer at home each month. Like it's just this whole weird nightmare. Yeah, I think that there's a lot to think about there. You know, you're reminding me of a recommendation that I've heard a lot that one might think would be a smart thing to do, but runs into some kind of, again, nuanced weird problems, which is, say you're gonna sign up for a social media account, should you, when you're signing up for it, just like with a bank account, say what should happen to it when you die? And some people propose this. We've sometimes thought about, at certain points of life, maybe every year, maybe some of you on Facebook have seen the privacy dinosaur that's like, hey, I'm a dinosaur, let's check your privacy settings, is everything good? I don't know why it's a dinosaur, there was some research, I don't remember. But we've thought about those approaches too, but it turns out that the most valuable new user of a platform is someone who just turned 13. And in the US, someone who just turned 13 cannot agree to any of these things because they're under 18. Also, you might like freak them the hell out, and they might not sign up for, you know, Be Real or whatever the new hotness is. So there's some really kind of interesting, you can judge them however you want, but those are the kind of the variables that they're weighing through as they're thinking about how do we manage this thing that, you know, as David and Jamie pointed out, like is not always in their interest, but I think should be. I don't know how long these things typically over. I can talk all day. But I don't